stands uniquely among the prophetic books of the Bible. Instead of immediately presenting messages of judgment or divine hope, the prophet opens his text with a profound and direct dialogue with God. This dialogue carries an intense tone of questioning, something that might seem bold or even dangerous to many. Habakkuk does not address the people of Judah. He speaks directly to the Creator. This approach makes the prophet especially remarkable, as his words reflect an emotional and spiritual weight that transcends generations and resonates even today. In Habakkuk's historical context, the kingdom of Judah was on the brink of collapse in every sense. Violence, corruption, and injustice were not only rampant among the leaders but also deeply ingrained in the lives of ordinary people. While other prophets often delivered messages of hope or judgment on behalf of God, Habakkuk begins with a complaint that borders on lament. He was disturbed and frustrated as he witnessed evil triumphing before his very eyes, a situation that seemed unbearable to him. Imagine the streets of Judah at that time, filled with violence, the weak suffering at the hands of the powerful, and a government completely indifferent to the people's plight. Laws were ignored, and those in power exploited every opportunity to oppress others. Unable to bear this reality any longer, Habakkuk turns to God with questions that echo the cries of many hearts. Why does the Lord not intervene? Why does he remain silent while evil prevails? This questioning marks the beginning of his spiritual journey, a journey filled with difficult questions and surprising answers. Habakkuk speaks with the intensity of someone who suffers deeply from the reality around him. He carries a heavy burden in his heart, and his faith is being tested. Instead of keeping his doubts to himself, Habakkuk chooses to confront the Creator directly, seeking to understand what is happening. This reveals something profound about Habakkuk's relationship with God. He has enough freedom to express his anguish, doubts, and frustrations openly. Habakkuk does not doubt God's existence. He questions his silence in the face of so much injustice. The introduction to the book of Habakkuk does not present a perfect man or a serene prophet. On the contrary, Habakkuk is a real man with real emotions. He approaches God with sincerity, even when his words are filled with pain and confusion. To fully grasp the depth of this introduction, we must remember that in Jewish tradition, questioning God was not considered a lack of faith. On the contrary, it was seen as an honest expression of seeking answers and a demonstration of intimacy with the Creator. Therefore, Habakkuk teaches us something invaluable in the opening moments of his narrative. God allows his servants to question him. This does not signify rebellion or disrespect. It means that our relationship with God can be deep enough to allow for vulnerability. Habakkuk is not criticizing God for the sake of criticism. He is trying to understand what seems incomprehensible. He does not hide his pain or pretend that everything is fine. He brings his concerns to the one who can truly provide answers. As Habakkuk looks at the society around him, he sees the contrast between God's holiness and the reality of human sin. For him, the situation is unbearable because he knows who God is, a just, holy, and faithful God. It is precisely this knowledge that makes his questions even more intense. If God is just, why does he not act? If God is holy, why does he allow evil to prosper? These questions are, in fact, expressions of faith. Only someone who believes in God can question his apparent inaction. Only someone who trusts in God's character can feel anguish when it seems like he is not acting. This initial interaction between Habakkuk and God is not merely a lament. It is the beginning of a sincere quest for understanding. The prophet refuses to accept silence as an answer. He cries out, questions, and waits. It is important to note that Habakkuk does not seek human solutions to Judah's problems. He does not attempt to mobilize the people or start a rebellion. Instead, he turns his eyes to God because he knows that only the Creator can provide a true solution. This introduction to the book confronts us with a deep reflection. What do we do when God seems distant? How do we react when our prayers go unanswered? Habakkuk invites us to be honest with God. He shows us that we can bring our hardest questions to the Father because he is capable of handling our doubts and weaknesses. The first chapter of the book does not give immediate answers. Habakkuk is only beginning his journey of questioning and seeking. The prophet speaks with sincerity, and God has not yet responded. But one thing is clear, the dialogue has begun. Habakkuk has opened his heart, and now he waits for God's response. This waiting is filled with tension and expecta. Habakkuk's world is not so different from ours. We too live in a time where injustice often seems to prevail, with wars, corruption, and violence ever present. Many, like Habakkuk, look around and ask, "Where is God in all this?" The prophet reminds us that these questions are not new, and even in the darkest moments of history, we can bring our anguish before the Lord. Habakkuk does not give up seeking. He refuses to accept silence as a definitive answer. And while chaos seems to reign, he waits. He waits for God's response because deep down, he still believes that the Lord is just and faithful. This faith, even amidst confusion, sustains the prophet as he tries to understand what's happening. Habakkuk does not yet know what God will say. He has no answers, but the very act of bringing his questions before the Creator is itself an act of faith. He is willing to listen, even if the answers will be difficult to accept. And when God finally responds, his words will challenge everything Habakkuk thought he knew. The Lord's reply will not end the prophet's questions, but will mark the beginning of a deeper understanding of who God is and how he works in the world. Before Habakkuk lies an overwhelming tension: the spiritual and social collapse of Judah, the spread of injustice like a shadow, and God's silence. Everything the prophet sees around him deeply troubles him. He observes God's chosen people, those freed from Egypt and called to reflect divine holiness, completely corrupted. What was once a nation united by the law and the promise is now fragmented by greed, violence, and idolatry. Justice is absent, and the innocent suffer under the hands of the powerful. This painful reality leads Habakkuk to ask a bold and unsettling question. Why is God allowing this to happen? In the opening verses of chapter 1, starting in verse 2, Habakkuk begins his dialogue with God, expressing his frustration in words filled with emotion and despair. He cries, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen?" The prophet's anguish spills over. This is not a simple lament, but the cry of someone weary from witnessing evil triumph and waiting for an answer that never comes. Habakkuk is not questioning God's existence or power, but rather his apparent inaction. For the prophet, divine silence in the face of suffering is unbearable. Habakkuk sees sin spreading like a plague within Judah. The people no longer follow the law, judges are corrupt, and the poor are crushed under the weight of the wealthy's injustice. Violence fills the streets, and those who try to do good are ignored or persecuted. Truth, the foundation of any society, has been replaced by lies and oppression. As he describes in verse 4, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. For Habakkuk, the world has turned upside down. What should be right has become wrong, and what should be condemned is accepted. This is not happening among pagan nations but within God's own people, making it even more painful. Habakkuk knows that God is holy and just, yet he cannot understand why he seems to allow such injustice to prosper. The prophet cries out, but the heavens remain silent. Like anyone who has faced profound suffering, Habakkuk begins to wonder if God is listening, if he cares. Yet it's crucial to recognize that Habakkuk is not abandoning his faith. On the contrary, he is turning to the only place he believes can provide answers: God himself. Habakkuk understands that his doubts cannot be resolved by human reasoning, politics, or military strength. Only the Creator can bring clarity to what is happening. So the prophet approaches God with complete honesty, unafraid to express his deepest anguish. This attitude teaches us something profound. True faith does not ignore difficulties or pretend everything is fine. True faith approaches God with sincerity, even when the pain feels overwhelming. Habakkuk does not hide his doubts or confusion. He speaks openly, trusting that God will listen. He shows us that having faith does not mean having all the answers, but knowing where to turn when the questions become too heavy. Humanity since the fall. Habakkuk, as a representative of all who have questioned God's silence, puts these doubts into words. Moreover, Habakkuk understands that Judah's situation is not just a political or social problem, it is a spiritual crisis. The people have turned away from God, opening the door for sin to dominate the nation. When justice is abandoned,